After my daughter's funeral, the landlord of the house she lived in called me. He said, "I found something you really need to see in your daughter's room. Follow me now." I went there immediately. When I opened the door, what I saw shocked me. I will tell you everything. Before then, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time is it there. Let me take you back to the beginning. "We found some things in the house," the landlord said, standing half in the doorway, half out, as if he wasn't sure which side of my life he belonged on. I didn't know who else to call after the funeral. The words landed without ceremony, blunt and badly timed, and I remember staring at the brass numbers on the door instead of his face, trying to understand why anyone would want to talk about a house on the same day I had lowered my daughter into the ground. I had not even changed out of my black suit yet. My shoes were still dusted with cemetery gravel. I nodded anyway, because grief had already taken my ability to argue. The house looked smaller than I remembered when I stepped inside, quieter in a way that felt deliberate rather than empty. The air smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and old wood, like someone had tried too hard to erase a presence and failed. The landlord shut the door behind me and locked it, not dramatically, just carefully, and that was the first moment I felt something other than grief move through my chest. He didn't offer me a seat. He didn't ask how I was holding up. Instead, he walked to the dining table and pulled out a thick folder, beige and swollen, the kind that had been overfed for too long. I remember thinking, absurdly, that whatever was inside had been waiting for me longer than I knew. "I was getting the place ready," he said, his voice steady but cautious, like a man walking across thin ice. "After what happened, I thought it was best to document everything. I started noticing irregularities." He slid the folder toward me, but didn't let go right away, his fingers still pressing down on the cover as if he might reconsider. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet thought formed, the kind that doesn't yet have words but already knows it will matter later. If I opened that folder, something would change. Not immediately, not visibly, but permanently. I opened it anyway, because by then I had already lost the only thing I thought I couldn't survive losing. The first few pages were harmless enough, or so I thought at the time. Copies of lease agreements, maintenance reports, utility bills with dates circled in red ink. The landlord watched my face carefully as I flipped through them, like he was waiting for a specific reaction and worried he might miss it. My mind drifted back to the funeral that morning, to the way my wife had stood stiffly beside me, her hand light on my arm, offering support that felt rehearsed. I told myself this meeting was about responsibility, about closing loose ends. Even then, some instinct warned me that nothing truly closes unless someone wants it to. "It's the later pages," the landlord said finally, clearing his throat. That's where I stopped understanding what I was looking at. He stood up and walked to the window, giving me privacy without leaving the room, which somehow made it worse. When I turned the page, the paper felt heavier, thicker, like it resisted being moved. What stared back at me was not a bill or a report, but a detailed drawing, precise and unmistakable. It was my house, not my daughter's rented place, my house. Every room mapped out, every entry point marked. I remember blinking hard, convinced grief had finally started to bend reality, because there was no logical reason for my home to be there. I traced the lines with my finger, slow and deliberate, as if I could erase them by touching them. The bedrooms were labeled, the study, even the small storage room near the back that most people forgot existed. Notes crowded the margins in handwriting I didn't recognize, arrows pointing to doors, windows, habits. Leaves at 7:30. Alone on Tuesdays. My mouth went dry, and I realized I had stopped breathing properly. The landlord turned around then, saw my face, and nodded once, grimly, like a man who had just received confirmation of something he feared but didn't want to name. I told myself there had to be an explanation, even as the room seemed to tilt. "I didn't know if I should call the police," he said, his voice lower now, closer. "I didn't even know if this was criminal, but your name was everywhere. Your routines, your property." And then I found the cameras. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small device, no bigger than my thumb. Placing it gently on the table like evidence in a courtroom drama, I had never agreed to participate in. My phone buzzed in my pocket then, sharp and intrusive, and when I glanced at the screen, I saw my wife's name. I didn't answer. I couldn't trust my voice to behave. The landlord showed me where the cameras had been hidden, describing it all in careful detail while I stared at nothing. Behind a vent, inside a smoke detector, angles chosen for coverage, not convenience. He told me how he had noticed unusual wiring while fixing a leak, how one discovery led to another. I nodded mechanically, absorbing words without fully processing them, because part of me was still stuck on the idea that my daughter, my child, had lived surrounded by things I never knew about. A thought crept in, unwelcome and persistent. If strangers had been watching her, what else had they been planning? The answer, I would later learn, was far worse than surveillance. By the time he mentioned videos, my grief had been pushed aside by something colder and more focused. He hadn't played them yet, but he didn't need to. The implication alone was enough to rearrange my understanding of the last few years of my life. I thought about how distant my daughter had become, how every visit had felt slightly rushed, slightly staged. I had blamed myself for that distance, assumed it was the natural drift of adulthood. Sitting there, staring at my own house drawn like a target, I understood that drift might have been intentional. And that understanding came with a quiet promise. Whatever this was, it would not end with confusion. "There's more," the landlord said, tapping the folder once, a nervous habit I was beginning to recognize. Names, messages, plans. I stopped reading when I realized I might be in over my head. Another vibration from my phone, this time a text. "Where are you?" It was from my son-in-law. I felt a strange, almost inappropriate calm settle over me as I slid the phone face down on the table. The calm scared me more than panic would have, because it felt like the moment before a storm finally chose its direction. I closed the folder slowly, not because I was done, but because I needed to prove to myself that I could. My reflection stared back at me from the polished table surface, older than I remembered, eyes hollowed out by grief and something sharper. I thanked the landlord for calling me, for not throwing everything away, for trusting his instincts. Even then, standing in that quiet house with a folder full of my life laid bare, I knew this meeting was only the beginning. I didn't confront anyone that day. I didn't make accusations or demands. But as I picked up the folder and walked back toward the door, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever waited in those pages would force me to draw a line I could never erase. The first document I pulled out after leaving the house wasn't about my daughter at all. It was a floor plan of my own home, folded so many times the creases had begun to tear. I had parked across the street instead of driving away. The folder balanced on the passenger seat like a presence I didn't want too close to me, yet couldn't ignore. I unfolded the paper carefully, smoothing it against the steering wheel, and felt something tighten behind my eyes. Every room was there. Every hallway. Even the narrow passage behind the kitchen pantry that only family knew about. This wasn't copied from public records. This was intimate, observed, learned. I sat there for a long time, watching people walk past my car, unaware that my sense of safety was quietly unraveling. The drawing was annotated with small notes written in different inks, different hands. Some comments were factual, measurements, angles, access points, but others were disturbingly personal. Keeps documents here. Sleeps lightly. Trusts wife completely. That last line felt like a hand closing around my throat. I told myself there had to be an explanation that didn't involve malice, but the truth pressed in from all sides. This wasn't curiosity. This was preparation. And preparation always pointed toward an end. When I turned the page, the documents shifted from diagrams to summaries, financial outlines, lists of assets, projected valuations. My estate, reduced to numbers and timelines. Properties I had worked decades to maintain were discussed with casual efficiency, as if I were already gone. I noticed phrases like transition period and post-event management, words that deliberately avoided naming what they implied. A quiet thought surfaced then, fully formed and impossible to ignore. This wasn't about inheritance after death. This was about control before it. And once that thought settled, it refused to leave. My phone buzzed again, sharper this time, and I flinched as if caught doing something wrong. Another text from my wife. We should talk tonight. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed, then turned the phone off completely. The silence that followed was heavy but necessary. For years, silence had been something imposed on me. Distance from friends, from siblings, from anyone who questioned my marriage. This silence, however, was mine. I needed it to think, because the pieces I was holding didn't yet form a picture, but I could feel their edges scraping against each other. As I continued reading, names began to appear. Some were unfamiliar, others vaguely recognizable from conversations my daughter had brushed off as unimportant. Just friends, she used to say, smiling too quickly. Now those names were listed alongside roles: logistics, enforcement, finance. One name was circled repeatedly, underlined so hard the paper had nearly torn. Next to it, a note read, "Trusted." Already inside. My stomach turned at that, because trust, once weaponized, becomes something else entirely. I realized then that whoever had written this understood family dynamics better than I ever had. 2 days later, I sat alone in my study at home, the folder spread out across my desk like a crime scene. I had told no one where I was that afternoon, not even my wife. The house felt different with the knowledge those pages carried. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like movement, every shadow like intention. I reviewed the documents again, slower this time, noticing patterns I had missed before. Dates lined up with moments in my life I remembered clearly. Arguments that seemed to come out of nowhere, sudden financial pressures, conversations that ended with me apologizing for things I hadn't done. One section of the folder was devoted entirely to routines. Mine. What time I left the house. Which days I drove myself. When I was most likely to be alone. It was detailed enough to feel invasive, but not detailed enough to be guessed. Someone had been watching me. Or rather, multiple people had. I thought of my daughter again, of how often she asked seemingly harmless questions about my schedule, my health, my plans. I had answered without suspicion, proud that she still cared. The memory burned now, not with anger, but with the slow ache of misplaced trust. A knock at the front door jolted me back into the room, my heart pounding harder than it should have. I closed the folder instinctively, sliding it into the desk drawer as if that could protect me. When I opened the door, it was a courier with a package I didn't remember ordering. I signed for it absently and closed the door again, leaning against it as my pulse settled. The interruption felt symbolic, like a reminder that the world hadn't paused just because mine was tilting. That was when I understood something else. Whatever was happening had been unfolding alongside my normal life, hidden in plain sight. By that weekend, I reached the section labeled contingencies, and the language shifted again, becoming colder, more decisive. Scenarios were outlined like chess moves, each response accounting for resistance, delay, exposure. One line stopped me entirely. If resistance increases, apply family pressure. Below it were names, mine, my wife's, my daughter's husband. The implication was unmistakable. I was not the architect of this plan, I was the obstacle. And obstacles, in plans like these, were meant to be removed, not negotiated with. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, letting that truth settle without rushing to soften it. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to clarity. Not peace, not acceptance, but awareness. I had spent years believing that loyalty was proven through sacrifice, that love meant narrowing my world to protect what I thought mattered most. Now I could see how that narrowing had made me vulnerable, how isolation had not been an accident, but a strategy. I didn't confront anyone then. I didn't even allow myself anger. I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that whatever came next would require patience. That night, I slept with the folder locked in my desk and my phone still turned off. Dreams came in fragments, hallways without doors, voices speaking just out of reach. When morning arrived, I felt changed, not by grief, but by resolve. I didn't yet know who all the players were or how far this plan extended, but I understood the direction it pointed. This wasn't about documents anymore. It was about intent. And intent, once revealed, demands an answer. I just hadn't decided yet what mine would be. The handwriting stopped me before the words did, slanted slightly to the right, neat in the way that suggested patience rather than care. I recognized it instantly, not because I had studied it closely over the years, but because I had trusted it implicitly. My wife's notes had always been the quiet kind. Lists on the refrigerator, reminders tucked into my briefcase, small domestic markers of a shared life. Seeing that same handwriting now, inked across documents that discussed my removal as if it were an administrative task, felt like discovering a familiar voice speaking a language I didn't know. I didn't turn the page right away. I just stared, letting the recognition settle into something heavier. The sentence that followed was not dramatic. It didn't need to be. I no longer see him as my husband. The words sat there plainly, without apology or flourish, followed by a plan outlined with bullet points and timelines. She wrote about efficiency, about speed, about minimizing complications. One line referenced a new beginning. Another mentioned a partner who understands sacrifice. I realized then that betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting or rage. Sometimes it comes carefully phrased, written by someone who has already moved on emotionally and is simply waiting for logistics to catch up. I read slowly, forcing myself not to skim, because this wasn't a moment for shortcuts. The documents referenced meetings I had never known about, decisions made in rooms I had never entered. My daughter's husband appeared repeatedly, his name circled and annotated with phrases like fully aligned and committed. I felt a sharp, unexpected sting at that, not because I had been close to him, but because I had defended him when others expressed concern. I had told myself he was reserved, misunderstood. Sitting there, surrounded by evidence to the contrary, I understood how easily my need for family harmony had been used against me. By mid-afternoon, the videos became unavoidable. I had delayed watching them, clinging to the illusion that paper alone might be enough, but some part of me needed confirmation that couldn't be rationalized away. I set my laptop on the desk, connected the drive, and pressed play. The footage was grainy but clear enough. My daughter's living room. Faces I didn't recognize at first, then gradually did. Conversations unfolded casually, punctuated by laughter, by gestures that suggested familiarity and comfort. Plans were discussed openly, without fear of interruption. I watched myself described as an obstacle, a variable to be managed, and felt something inside me harden into resolve. What shocked me most was not the content of those conversations, but their tone. There was no hatred in their voices, no anger or resentment. They spoke about me the way one might speak about weather, unfortunate, unpredictable, but ultimately manageable. That detachment cut deeper than rage ever could have. It told me that by the time these plans were made, I had already ceased to matter as a person. I was a condition, not a father, not a husband. And once someone reaches that point, there is no appeal left to make. A text message appeared on my screen while the video continued playing, the timing almost cruel in its precision. "Dinner's ready. Where are you?" My wife's words felt surreal, disconnected from the reality unfolding in front of me. I paused the video and stared at the message, my mind briefly splitting into two versions of my life, the one I had believed in and the one now demanding acknowledgement. I didn't reply. Instead, I took a screenshot of the paused frame, my daughter's familiar sofa visible behind a group of people plotting my future without me. I didn't know why I did that then, only that some instinct told me to preserve the moment. By that evening, shock had given way to something steadier. Not anger, not grief, but clarity. I thought back over my marriage, over the subtle shifts that had seemed insignificant at the time, how friendships faded one by one, always with reasonable explanations. How my siblings became too critical, then unhelpful, then a distraction. I remembered defending those changes as necessary compromises, proof of my commitment. Now I could see the pattern for what it was. A slow narrowing of my world until only a few voices remained, all echoing the same perspective. Isolation had not been an accident. It had been preparation. A knock on the door startled me out of my thoughts, and for a brief moment, fear surged through me, sharp and unwelcome. When I opened it, it was only a neighbor returning a misdelivered package, apologizing profusely. I thanked him, exchanged a few polite words, and closed the door again, leaning my forehead against the wood. The ordinary nature of the interruption felt almost obscene against the weight of what I had learned. Life outside my walls continued as usual, unaware that my understanding of trust had just collapsed entirely. Late that night, I returned to the document with my wife's handwriting, rereading the sentence that had first stopped me. This time, I noticed what followed it: a date, a window of opportunity. The language grew more urgent toward the end, references to acting before doubts resurface and ensuring cooperation. Cooperation. The word echoed in my mind, stripped of its usual meaning. They weren't asking for my agreement. They were counting on my compliance, on the version of me that avoided conflict, that trusted too easily, that believed love was something to be proven through silence. I closed the folder and sat back, folding my hands together to stop them from shaking. In that moment, I understood that the life I had been living was already over, not because of what they planned to do, but because of what I now knew. Knowledge creates a boundary all its own, and once crossed, there is no returning to ignorance. I didn't confront my wife that night. I didn't call my son-in-law or demand explanations. I understood, with a calm certainty, that confrontation would only alert them. Whatever I did next would have to be deliberate, controlled, and final. Before going to bed, I wrote down a single sentence on a piece of paper and placed it in the folder, right on top. It wasn't an accusation or a threat. It was a reminder to myself. This ends when I decide it ends. I slept lightly, aware of every sound, every shift in the house, but without panic. For the first time since the funeral, fear no longer dictated my thoughts. Something else had taken its place: resolve, sharpened by betrayal, waiting patiently for the right moment to act. "Are you here to report a crime?" the officer asked, looking up from his desk with an expression that suggested he was already bracing for a long morning. I hadn't planned the words I would use, hadn't rehearsed the moment the way people do when they expect emotion to carry them through. Instead, I placed the folder on the counter between us, thick and unassuming, and said, "Several," with a calm that surprised even me. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. Whatever fear I had felt in the days leading up to this moment had already burned itself out, leaving behind something steadier and far less forgiving. The room was smaller than I expected, cramped with filing cabinets and the low hum of fluorescent lights. As I opened the folder and began explaining what I had found, I noticed the officer's posture change almost imperceptibly. He leaned forward, then called another officer over without interrupting me. I spoke slowly, methodically, resisting the urge to editorialize or justify. I stuck to facts, documents, diagrams, recordings, dates. Every so often, one of them would exchange a glance with the other, the kind that carried more meaning than words. That was when I knew this was no longer just a concerned father's story. This was evidence. They asked me how I had obtained the materials, and I explained about the landlord, about the hidden cameras, about my decision not to confront anyone involved. One officer nodded approvingly at that, noting that confrontation could have compromised the investigation or my safety. Safety. The word felt strange in that room, like something theoretical rather than practical. I had lived in my own home for years without fear, trusting the people closest to me. Now, sitting under institutional lighting, I realized how fragile that trust had always been. Safety, I was learning, isn't about familiarity. It's about awareness. By the time they reached the video recordings, the atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. They watched in silence, occasionally pausing to note timestamps or names. When my wife appeared on screen, her profile unmistakable even in low resolution, I didn't react. I had already mourned that version of her. What I felt instead was distance, as if I were watching a stranger who happened to share my history. One of the officers glanced at me then, perhaps expecting anger or disbelief, but all he found was resolve. That seemed to unsettle him more than emotion would have. They told me I would need to provide a formal statement, that the materials suggested conspiracy, fraud, and credible threats. I nodded and followed them into another room, where I recounted everything again, this time recorded, my words becoming part of an official narrative I could no longer control. As I spoke, I became aware of how cleanly the story fell into place, how each piece connected without effort. That coherence frightened me more than chaos would have. It meant the plan had been thorough. It meant this wasn't a misunderstanding or an impulsive act. It meant intent. Hours passed without my noticing. At some point, someone brought me coffee I didn't drink. My phone buzzed repeatedly in my pocket, muted but insistent, and I knew without checking who it would be. When the officers finally stood and thanked me for my cooperation, their tone was careful, professional, tinged with something like respect. They told me they would take it from here, that arrests would likely follow once warrants were secured. Likely. The word felt inadequate, but I understood the language of procedure well enough to accept it. Justice, I was learning, moves deliberately. I left the station just as evening settled in, the sky dimming into that uncertain blue that makes everything look suspended between states. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine, listening to the quiet tick of cooling metal. I felt no triumph, no relief, only a deep, bone-level exhaustion. Turning in the people closest to me had not been an act of courage or revenge. It had been necessity. The distinction mattered because it reminded me that this wasn't about punishment. It was about survival. The arrests happened 2 days later. I learned about them through a news alert that flashed briefly across my phone screen while I stood in the kitchen, staring at nothing. The headline was vague, careful not to name names yet, but I recognized the details immediately. Multiple individuals. Coordinated effort. Investigation ongoing. I set the phone down and continued making tea, my movements slow and deliberate. The world had acknowledged what I already knew, and yet nothing felt resolved. Consequences had begun, but closure remained distant. Neighbors offered awkward condolences when they saw me, their voices lowered as if volume alone could protect me from reality. Some asked questions I didn't answer. Others avoided eye contact entirely. I didn't blame them. Tragedy makes people uncomfortable, especially when it refuses to stay neatly categorized. I returned home each evening to a house that felt both familiar and foreign, every room now layered with knowledge I couldn't unsee. The walls hadn't changed, but my understanding of what had happened within them had altered everything. I did not attend the interrogations or the preliminary hearings. I had no interest in watching explanations unravel or excuses take shape. Whatever they had to say would not restore what had been broken. Instead, I spent those days alone, sorting through memories with the same care I had once applied to documents. I allowed myself grief, not just for my daughter, but for the life I thought I had built. Grief, I learned, doesn't demand answers. It demands acknowledgement. And once acknowledged, it leaves room for something else to grow. One evening, as I sat in the living room with the lights off, I realized that the prison doors closing behind them would not mark the end of this chapter for me. Justice had been set in motion, but justice alone does not heal betrayal. That work would be mine, and mine alone. I understood then that the most important decision still lay ahead, waiting quietly for me to claim it. The fallout was not over. It was simply changing form. I stood outside my brother's house for 10 full minutes before knocking, my hand hovering inches from the door like it no longer remembered how to finish the motion. The porch light buzzed softly above me, attracting moths that beat themselves senseless against the glass, and I fixated on that sound because it was easier than confronting the weight pressing against my chest. I hadn't been there in years. The last time I had seen that door, I had walked away from it convinced I was doing the right thing, convinced loyalty to my marriage required distance from my own blood. Standing there now, I knew whatever waited on the other side would change me again, one way or another. When the door finally opened, my brother didn't speak at first. He just looked at me, his expression moving through surprise, caution, and something softer I hadn't expected, recognition. He stepped aside without a word, and I took that as permission. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and old books, familiar in a way that made my throat tighten. We sat at the kitchen table like strangers negotiating a truce, and before he could ask why I was there, I said it. I'm sorry, not for the silence alone, but for the arrogance that had allowed me to believe I knew better than everyone who had tried to warn me. The apology opened something I hadn't anticipated. He listened without interrupting as I spoke, my words slow and deliberate, stripped of justification. I told him about the documents, the betrayal, the arrests, not to shock him, but to explain how thoroughly wrong I had been. When I finished, he exhaled deeply and said, "We always worried something like this would happen. Not with satisfaction, not with judgment, but with sadness." That hurt more than anger would have, because it meant my isolation had been visible long before I acknowledged it. It meant I hadn't just lost time. I had wasted concern freely given. Over the next few weeks, I reached out to my other siblings, each conversation unfolding differently, but leading to the same place. Some were cautious, some openly emotional, but none turned me away. They told me how my absence had been explained away, how my wife had framed it as my choice, my need for space. Hearing that made something settle uncomfortably in my chest. Not guilt, exactly, but responsibility. I had allowed myself to be spoken for. I had accepted distance as peace. Reconnecting didn't erase the years apart, but it anchored me in something real again, something that didn't require silence to survive. Life began to take on a quieter rhythm after that, measured not by crisis, but by routine. Months passed. Court dates came and went without my presence. Occasionally, a legal notice arrived in the mail, its language precise and impersonal, reminding me that consequences were still unfolding somewhere beyond my control. I filed them away without ceremony. The real work was happening elsewhere, around dinner tables, during long phone calls, in the spaces where I relearned how to speak honestly without fear of repercussion. I understood then that isolation hadn't just made me vulnerable. It had made me forget who I was when no one was watching. One afternoon, while sorting through old paperwork, I came across my will. It was dated years back, written during a time when I believed continuity was a form of security. I sat with it spread across the desk, reading clauses that no longer felt like they belonged to me. Names appeared there that now carried entirely different meanings. Intentions I once thought were generous now felt naive. I realized with startling clarity that if something happened to me tomorrow, I would still be participating in a system that had nearly destroyed me. That realization didn't frighten me. It focused me. A call from my sister interrupted my thoughts, her voice casual, asking if I wanted to join her family for dinner that weekend. I said yes without hesitation, and after hanging up, I noticed how natural the answer had felt. That was when I understood the depth of what I had lost and what I was beginning to regain. Trust, I was learning, doesn't announce itself. It grows quietly when conditions allow it to. And conditions had finally changed. I was no longer shrinking my world to keep peace. I was expanding it to tell the truth. By the end of that season, the house felt different. Not lighter exactly, but steadier. I rearranged rooms, boxed up reminders I no longer needed, let sunlight in where it had been blocked for years. These weren't acts of erasure. They were acknowledgments that I was allowed to move forward without carrying everything with me. Each small change felt like a declaration, not of victory, but of intent. I wasn't rebuilding what had been broken. I was building something new, informed by loss but not defined by it. Still, one decision remained unresolved, hovering at the edge of my awareness. I knew it would be final, that it would draw a line no explanation could blur. I didn't rush it. I let the understanding mature, knowing that haste had been my enemy before. As I folded the old will and placed it back in the drawer, I felt a calm certainty settle in. The last boundary I needed to set wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about choosing, deliberately and without apology, who would never again have power over my life. "Are you sure?" the lawyer asked, looking up from the document with a pause that carried more weight than the question itself. His pen hovered above the page, unmoving, as if he understood that once the ink touched paper, there would be no revision that mattered. I didn't answer immediately. I watched the light from the window stretch across his desk, illuminating the edges of a life I was about to formally dismantle. Then I nodded once, not with hesitation, but with the quiet certainty that comes only after every alternative has already failed. "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." I had spent weeks preparing for that moment, not by rehearsing words, but by sitting with the consequences of the decision. I had walked through my house at night, touching the walls, opening drawers, revisiting memories without flinching. I needed to be certain that what I was about to do wasn't driven by anger or fear, because those emotions fade, and I refused to let something temporary shape something permanent. This wasn't an act of spite. It was an act of truth. The truth was that nothing I owned should ever become leverage against me again, not in life, and not after it. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and continued, his voice steady as he explained the finality of the changes. Every asset, every account, every property was redirected away from bloodlines and expectations toward causes that existed beyond personal betrayal. Charity, in this case, wasn't about generosity. It was about insulation, about ensuring that no one could ever again wait for my absence to profit from it. As he spoke, I felt an unexpected lightness, not because I was giving something away, but because I was taking something back, control. Ownership, I realized, isn't just about possession. It's about intent. When I left the office, the world felt oddly unchanged. Cars passed. People talked on phones. Life moved forward without ceremony. That normalcy grounded me, reminding me that closure doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives when you stop resisting it. I drove home slowly, letting the finality of what I had done settle without dramatizing it. There would be no confrontation, no speeches, no declarations. The boundary had been set quietly, deliberately, and without the need for witnesses. That felt right. The most important decisions of my life had always been the ones made without an audience. I chose not to marry again, not as a vow born of bitterness, but as a recognition of where my trust now lived. Trust, I had learned, is not a resource to be spent recklessly or a prize to be won through persistence. It is a responsibility shared between people who protect it equally. I no longer felt compelled to prove my worth through partnership, to anchor my identity in someone else's approval. Companionship might one day find me, or it might not. Either way, my sense of self would no longer depend on it. That, too, was a boundary. Rebuilding relationships with my siblings became a steady, grounding presence in my life. We didn't pretend the lost years hadn't happened. We acknowledged them, named them, and then chose to move forward without letting them dictate every interaction. There was healing in that honesty, in the understanding that forgiveness does not require amnesia. Family, I learned, isn't about proximity or obligation. It's about showing up without an agenda. Every shared meal, every conversation that ended without tension, reinforced the quiet truth that I had not been alone all those years. I had simply been cut off. Occasionally, news filtered through about the people who had once planned my removal. Sentences handed down, appeals denied, names fading from relevance. I didn't seek those updates, but I didn't avoid them either. They no longer defined me. Justice had taken its course, imperfect and impersonal as it was. What mattered more was that I had survived without becoming what they assumed I would be: passive, predictable, compliant. I had not needed revenge to reclaim myself. I had needed clarity and the courage to act on it without apology. There were moments, of course, when grief returned unexpectedly. A familiar song, a photograph discovered in a forgotten box. My daughter's absence remained a permanent ache, one that no boundary could erase. I allowed that grief its space without letting it blur the lines I had drawn. Loving her did not require excusing what she had done. Mourning her did not obligate me to preserve a legacy built on deception. Two truths could exist at once, and accepting that complexity was part of my healing. I no longer needed clean narratives. I needed honest ones. As time passed, the house became a place of quiet rather than tension. I filled it with things that reflected who I was now, not who I had been expected to be. Books I had once avoided. Music I had stopped playing. Conversations that didn't end in self-doubt. The absence of manipulation created room for something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on compliance, but the durable kind that comes from self-respect. I understood then that boundaries are not walls meant to isolate. They are structures meant to protect what matters most. Looking back, I can see how easily this story could have ended differently. How silence, fear, or misplaced loyalty might have cost me everything. But it didn't. Because when the moment came, I chose myself. not in isolation, but in truth. That choice didn't make me hard. It made me whole. And if there is one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that standing up for yourself is not an act of defiance. It's an act of survival. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been isolated, manipulated, or pressured into silence, know this: it's never too late to draw a line. You don't owe access, loyalty, or sacrifice to anyone who treats your life like a resource to be claimed. If you found meaning in this story, please like this video so it reaches others who may need it, share it with someone who might feel alone in their struggle, and subscribe to this channel for more real, emotionally grounded stories about boundaries, betrayal, and self-respect. Sometimes the first boundary we set is simply telling our story out loud and choosing how it ends. See you soon in the next story.